We're now at chapter 16, called Miss Honey's Cottage. In the previous chapter, Matilda has proven to Miss Honey that she was able to tilt the glass with her own powers. And Miss Honey is obviously shocked and has invited Matilda to come to her house for further discussion. This chapter is very intimate again, in that it takes Matilda and Miss Honey outside of the school parameters and sees their relationship develop and how they treat each other and speak to each other. And essentially there's also an opening up of Matilda's world from the usual setting of what she's been exposed to date. Miss Honey and Matilda are walking together first through the town, and the settings become more and more country-like, and eventually there's nobody around, and we see Matilda changing in demeanor and in her interactions with Miss Honey. She's very excitable, jumping, skipping, chatting, and she's obviously excited about what happened. But you can also see this is a far more childish Matilda than we have encountered previously. And it also highlights how much she is, again, just a little child. And also the way that she speaks to Miss Honey about how she's going to use her powers, what she's going to do with them, how much she feels that she can achieve in terms of, pushing stuff over, moving stuff. And Miss Honey is very cautious, and luckily, yes, the adult that should probably be involved in the scenario. You also have Matilda showing how much she needs this adult involvement and how much she needs the encouragement and to be seen and recognized. And she asks, do you think it is interesting, the fact that she has this power? And then she asks, when Miss Honey says that it's a phenomenon, she goes, but am I a phenomenon? She just wants to be recognized and appreciated. In the passage that I'm going to read, we continue to see the difference between the adult, who is Miss Honey in this scenario, and Matilda, who is a young girl who's excited, giddy about her newfound powers. And also, as much as Matilda is willing to just go all out and experiment and all of this, Miss Honey is there trying to frame it and get the situation under control. I'll read the passage here. I myself, Miss Honey said, am probably far more bowled over by what you did than you are, and I'm trying to find some reasonable explanation. Such as what? Matilda asked. Such as whether or not it's got something to do with the fact that you are quite exceptionally precocious. What exactly does that word mean? Matilda said. A precocious child, Miss Honey said, is one that shows amazing intelligence early on. You are an unbelievably precocious child. Am I really? Matilda asked. Of course you are. You must be aware of that. Look at your reading. Look at your mathematics. I suppose you're right, Matilda said. Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of conceit and self-consciousness. Miss Honey has to explain what the word precocious is to a precocious child. So as intelligent as Matilda is, she is but a child, and the fact that she has to ask, well, and can ask Miss Honey, that is revealing in itself. So first, Miss Honey, she's so shocked that Matilda is unaware of this, and part of the unawareness is likely a result of the Wormwood's neglect, which goes back to the very first chapter, where we have a description of how parents usually think that their children are absolutely exceptional, and whereas Matilda is exceptional, her parents have completely dismissed every instance of when she showed herself as being phenomenal child. And therefore, of course, Matilda may be completely unaware of this, and she seems to be prodding Miss Honey to understand these qualities about herself. And this prodding and this needing encouragement, which is very normal for children and adults, but especially for children, it highlights Matilda's youth and naivete and innocence. And she is intelligent, obviously, in the way that she interacts, but she isn't aware of it at all. Also, this is, in this interactions, her willingness to ask Miss Honey sees that she has found someone who she trusts and is able to open up with. And whereas she has been constantly dismissed by her parents previously and put aside and ridiculed in terms of everything that whenever she's tried to interact, she's finally found someone who can satisfy that craving and to be recognized, and also this need for an adult to take her seriously and to answer her questions fully and properly. And this allows her to be honest and open. Matilda is overexcited, and Miss Honey, to calm her down, starts distracting her by pointing out the trees that they are passing on this country road. And it seems as though the countryside gets rougher and rougher. And eventually they come to a gate which leads to the cottage where Miss Honey lives. And Miss Honey recites a passage from one of Dylan Thomas's poems. Dylan Thomas is a very famous poet who was quite close, who was at the same time as Roald Dahl. However, his literary works were very different, since Roald Dahl focused on children's poetry, but they are probably the two best known writers who were born in Wales. So it's nice that Roald Dahl, uses him over here. Also, in reciting this poetry, it's a moment where we see Miss Honey as being vulnerable, and she's also quite embarrassed after she recites the poetry, but we're able to have a glimpse into her own preferences rather than the teacher who is always catering to the children's needs. So we're getting to know Miss Honey as well, and she is allowing herself to open up in front of Matilda. Matilda, through all of this, we see her reaction to a whole new world and new experiences and perspectives as she comes across where Miss Honey lives. We're going to read the passage here. "You mean you live down here?" Matilda asked. "I do," Miss Honey replied. But she said no more. Matilda had never once stopped to think about where Miss Honey might be living. She had always regarded her purely as a teacher, a person who turned up out of nowhere and taught at school and then went away again. Do any of us children, she wondered, ever stop to ask ourselves where our teachers go when school is over for the day? Do we wonder if they live alone, or if there is a mother at home, or a sister, or a husband? Do you live all by yourself, Miss Honey? She asked. Yes, Miss Honey said. Very much so. This is a very, very thoughtful internal discussion that Matilda is having. As her world is expanding, she's also questioning herself. She's also questioning the way that she has regarded things previously. She notices that she hasn't taken any attention in terms of where her teacher goes to after or before school, what her life might be like. And here she is just saying, so she's trying to come to terms with this. And because of their relationship, Matilda is able to ask Miss Honey quite openly. And Miss Honey, being very candid and again building on that trust that she has with Matilda, accepts to answer all of the questions that Matilda has. Miss Honey seems to live in a very wayward, very isolated place. She explains on a small farm worker's cottage, and this is naturally quite new to Matilda, who lives in the town centre. And also this gradual progression that we're taken through the town centre, then through the countryside, and eventually down this rather rickety road, builds our expectations for what we're going to find out about Miss Honey, which will really bring the theme of women and financial security back in focus. Miss Honey takes Matilda to her cottage, and as they get there, Matilda's full of wonderment at beholding this tiny little cottage, which is, falling apart, and reminds her of all these fairy tales, and even the descriptions of Miss Honey having to crouch down, even though she's not a very tall woman, to get in there. Everything is described in very meager terms. There's a constant repetition of no, not having this, not having that. So there's the feeling of lack, of everything being little and not enough. And also the word that's constantly used is there's only this, there was only that, and description even of the paint being whitewash. So Matilda is both completely taken aback and at the same time being a little girl, and she's sent out to get a bucket of water and to be able to make their tea. And she's having great fun, and she says, yes, I've never done this before, this is so much fun. But of course, gradually, just from this being a kind of camping trip fun thing to do for Matilda, she realizes very slowly that this is how her teacher lives. So it's all starts to be very sinister, and it's part of Matilda continuing to kind of broaden her sphere of life. And this is, of course, comes down to the meaningful interactions of people sharing their lives and the relationships that they have with each other, is that you're able to understand different perspectives, different situations. And she's obviously shocked and realizes that the world is much bigger and scarier than she could ever imagine. And there is this discussion even about, she realizes that her beloved teacher doesn't even have running water, a basic amenity such as running water in her own house. When she asks her how she's able to have a bath, and she says, I don't bathe myself, basically, and she washes herself standing up, which is what she describes what poor people did not a very long time ago. And Miss Honey doesn't seem to feel overly sorry for herself. She says, I have a Primus and so on. I'll read the passage from the book here. Are you poor, Miss Honey? Yes, Miss Honey said. Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it? The Primus was roaring away with a powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves into it. She also found half a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then, from a plastic container, she took margarine and spread it on the bread. Margarine. Matilda thought. She really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray, and on it she put 2 mugs, the teapot, the half bottle of milk, and a plate with the 2 slices of bread. I'm afraid I don't have any sugar, she said. I never use it. That's all right, Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and she was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion. The reference to margarine here is significant because the author is trying to depict just how poor Miss Honey is, and margarine had been introduced when there was an issue many years before in producing butter, and it is essentially an alternative to butter, but it has no fresh ingredients. It is simply made of oil and additives, and it is extremely affordable. It is very cheap and not particularly tasty in comparison to what butter would be. And of course, this is all the comparisons that Matilda is now having to make between, you know, the amenities that she has in her own home, where we know that the Wormwoods are fairly comfortable, definitely, and what she would have had to tea, but also it's her coming to terms with even margarine. This is how bad it is. Um, it's it's an incredible passage where the interaction continues between Miss Honey and Matilda in a very candid way, and it gives us a look at how relationships evolve and the synergy in their relationships, very much like Miss Honey had given Matilda a chance and had not shut her down when Matilda said that she was able to move things with the power of her mind. Matilda now, even though she is naive and young and asks very straight questions, such as, "Are you poor, Miss Honey?" And Miss Honey answers openly. At the same time, Matilda is also mature enough to know that she needs to tread carefully and not embarrass Miss Honey about, you know, the food that she's being offered, and also, you know, how she reacts to there not being sugar and so on and so forth. Once Miss Honey prepares the tea, she takes Matilda into the sitting room, which is usually where the room where you would receive guests. So there's the living room, which is usually where the TV is, and the sitting room where you receive guests. And nowadays, mostly those two things have been joined together in many households. But in this case, the sitting room continues to portray just the how absolutely poor and the minimal amenities that Miss Honey lives with in her little cottage. And this brings it back to Matilda in such a stark way. And I would read the passage right here. Matilda was appalled. Was this really where her neat and trimly dressed schoolteacher lived? Was this all she had to come back to after a day's work? It was unbelievable. And what was the reason for it? There was something very strange going on around here, surely. Matilda was appalled. The word appalled means shocked and disappointed. And this takes us back to originally where Matilda had this internal dialogue with herself about where do teachers live, who do they live with, what do they do outside of the school. And now this closes that notion and answers that question, and she is just horrified by the result. And of course, she actually says it was unbelievable. And from you know, first thinking of it as fun, she gets the feeling that there's something wrong here. And as she says, there was something very strange going on around her. She notices, she knows that this can't be Miss Honey's choice to be living in this way. Nobody would want to live in this way. There's also an important idea here where you're contrasting Matilda in her home with all the amenities and all the comforts, and how although she might have been able to have you know, toast with jam and slices of cake, and she was obviously in a much more comfortable home, there's a big difference to where her relationship is with Miss Honey versus the Wormwoods, who, of course, she was completely cowed. She was relegated to her bedroom to read, or she had to just sit on the armchair very quietly while her father would have discussions with her brother, whereas she is fully interactive in this place, which is clearly extremely poor. It's described as, you know, for example, the sitting room, the room was as small and square and bare as a prison cell. The only objects in the entire room were two upturned wooden boxes to serve as chairs and a third box between them for a table. That was all. And yet, although it is not a nice place, maybe it does not have the comforts, it is, though, a place where Matilda is safe and Miss Honey feels safe, and they are away from those that are able to inflict and overpower them. And this is where nurturing and caring relationships are able to thrive and grow. It also sets the scene in terms of the reader expecting to try and unravel why Miss Honey, being a teacher and being, at least she's gainfully employed, she earns her own salary, why she is living in such meager circumstances. And there's also a return at the end of the chapter to looking at Matilda's powers, and we get the feeling that potentially this is going to be where her powers will be employed potentially.